Hello. Today we have the pleasure of having our colleague Nathalie Verschelde from the European Commission, DG Regio, with us to enlighten us a little bit more about Policy Objective 5. Nathalie, your turn.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And once more, thank you very much to Interact for organizing this alternative arrangement to the workshop we had planned in Leuven. I do hope that everyone is keeping safe, that everyone is healthy, and that the confinement is not too heavy a burden on you. I also do hope that you have had the chance to listen to the presentations that were already recorded by the two external experts that we invited, Jean Pironi and Eduardo Medeiros, because they shed some very useful light on some of the topics that we want to cover also today. So with this said, my first slide is actually an important warning. I wanted to let you know very openly and transparently that the information that I will share with you today is, of course, information that was available prior to the COVID-19 pandemic that we are experiencing now in Europe. Since the pandemic has broken out, a lot of things have happened, mainly to respond quickly to the crisis. But we cannot exclude at all that the cohesion and the Interreg agenda that we, as we know it now, might change. I put considerably here on the slide. It might be not so considerable, but there might be some reactions to the current crisis and to the fact that economically, for sure, and socially, it will take months and years to recover from this crisis, and that therefore things might be a little bit different in a few months' time. There's not really any way of knowing right now today, so that's why I wanted to give you this warning. And then to conclude on the warning, what I propose to do today is to focus on the common understanding we have of the intentions that the Commission has put into the regulations, while acknowledging, of course, that the mechanics are not yet 100% stable. So we don't even have a full budget yet for Interreg, so we don't have all the elements in our hands. And I conclude with a plea to use the time smartly, to focus on the territorial features of your programs, of your areas, and to also use the time to get some inspiration from existing examples, some of which will also be available to you as part of this training on bringing territoriality to Interreg. I also know that a lot of the time is now spent on direct response to the crisis, but I'm pretty sure that you will not simply stop programming for the future, and that you will continue reflecting on how to have the best possible programs 21-27. So enough of the warnings. Now maybe some quick reminders. Interreg is part of cohesion policy. And cohesion policy is about reducing disparities and, of course, also increasing opportunities where people are. It's much more effective when the policy is place-based. We've had these discussions many, many times. And in addition to that, the formal name of Interreg is actually European Territorial Cooperation. Again, for us, a reminder that our starting point has to be the territories on which we operate, the areas that we are supposed to improve through Interreg. Of course, I exclude from that the interregional programs, but I guess they are not listening to this training as they are not territorially based. So we face territorial programs, cross-border and transnational. And if you have listened to Jean Pironi's presentation, you will also then understand more clearly that we are territorial in both cases, cross-border and transnational, but with different scales. We are talking about different types of territories on which different types of interactions take place. wanted to maybe remind you a little bit of that. And then if we go, we zoom in a little bit into the regulation, the provisional common understanding in the CPR at the moment calls PO5 a Europe closer to citizens by fostering the sustainable and integrated development of all types of territories and local initiatives. So here again, an undisputable link to the territories where we operate, to the places where people live. It's absolutely essential, and it has to be our starting point. Also, the local initiatives reference reminds us that acting locally where the impact can be greater is important, and that the notion of territorial scales from local, regional, national, European is also something that we have to keep in mind when we start preparing our programs for the future. And this brings me to a notion that we have been bringing to the discussion, at least from DG Regio's side, for a number of months now, and that is the notion of functional area. Again, the idea that Jean and Eduardo explained to you was to put some meat around the concept, some academic meat around the concept, and you will have retained, I hope, from that you define your functional areas mainly from the notions of interactions and interdependencies. And that means links between people and links between activities that frame somebody's life. Education, obviously, health, work, leisure. These are all things that we do, all of us, and that are not defined by administrative boundaries. If you happen to live in a village A or in city A, and then you work in village B, city B, you cross boundaries, you cross administrative boundaries. It's more clear that the boundary is there when we talk, of course, about a national boundary, a border, but for many, many activities, we have to question whether this boundary should remain a boundary and should not become more of a binding factor rather than a separating factor. If you look at the recent crisis, you have seen that the reflex of many member states has been to immediately close the border, and you can see what sectors and what parts of lives have been affected directly by closing these borders. And that should really, really show us that we are in a world where the national boundary is not necessarily the thing that we need to base all our activities and funding on. You look at quartier, specific quarters inside large cities, a little bit the same principle. Travel to work areas are also functional areas. In French, we use a lot the word bassin, which in English you would translate more or less as catchment area. And I think catchment area is quite a powerful word, and it's very picturesque. You can actually picture a catchment area because it relates normally in English to more to water and a river, for instance, a catchment area of a river or of a sea. But you can apply the same principle to an employment catchment area or a health catchment area. And this is really fundamental to how we would like to approach PO5 in our future programs. When still on functional areas, you could have a functional area inside your program where you have a single thematic focus. For instance, you could say, here in my cross-border area, or indeed in my transnational area, we certainly have something to explore in terms of healthcare, because we have either a large area with few facilities, and we need to maximize access of patients to these facilities. And you have your notion of catchment area. Who do you catch with your healthcare system. And in that case, you would obviously put in place, you would choose to use PO4, sorry, of the next regulation, and then spend investments into improving access to healthcare. And that's what I would call a functional area with a single thematic focus. Or you can have a functional area with multi-thematic challenges requiring multi-thematic solutions. And here you would then definitely for sure go to PO5 for an integrated approach, an integrated development. Think, for instance, of the ITI that has been set up on the Slovene-Italian border. I think that's one of the cases that will illustrate the type of tools that can be used under PO5 by Sandra Sodini. If you think about that, there clearly in the area, functional area of the 3 municipalities that are very, very closely working together and actually very integrated territorially, you have there an integrated development because you need to address several issues simultaneously in different sectors. So this is a little bit for reminders and setting the scene. Now, if we go to the main purpose of today's training in how to use PO5, let's apply some of these reminders to what we have on the table. Territorial integration under PO5. You will read in the regulation that we need to be fostering the integrated social, economic, and environmental development, cultural heritage, and security. That's the actual wording. So again, you see the starting point is territorial, integrated, very, very important, that we need to tackle several issues at the same time, simultaneously, not ad hoc with one project here, one project there, but much more in a coordinated fashion. Which territory are we talking about? I think a lot of you wonder how they should look at their territories, how they should then find these integrated territorial areas. Well, let's see, there is no distinction of territory. You can have a functional area and you can apply integrated development principles on all types of territories, whether they are urban, whether they are rural, semi-rural, whether they are islands, mountains. All types of territories can be covered by PO5, but the whole point of having a single integrated territorial development strategy is that you have a coherent territory on which you want to act. Where do you have the most significant interactions and interdependencies in your program area? Where do you have those, and how can you then concentrate on these areas for PO5? Now, this is not an exact science. You will also have heard from Eduardo and Jean in the previous module that you can apply different types of readings to this notion of functional area, integrated territorial development. So there isn't a formula that we can give you with a list of, a checklist that you have to fill in. It's not really working like that. I would still advise you that the border orientation papers that we shared with you, particularly for land borders, have some hints and some elements that you should really use. When you talk about maritime cooperation, obviously, clearly, the starting point is the interaction across or around the maritime area. Now, can a cross-border program be one of these territories? Well, possibly. There are some areas where you would say that the entire program area, meaning the NUTS 3 areas along the border, are indeed showing all the signs of being a functional area. There is a high degree of interaction, and there are many interdependencies between the two sides of the border. and you actually can also see that you need to act in different sectors simultaneously if you want to make an impact and improve things. If on top of that, in those areas, you also have territorial governance mechanisms, and here I use, it's a bit of a monster word, but what I mean here is a Euro region or an EGTC, if you also have that, the chances are pretty high that you are facing a functional area on which you could apply integrated territorial development principles. I list here some examples. They are, of course, only indicative. It's really for the regions themselves to know and assess. But for instance, to me, it seems that the Upper Rhine, between France and Germany principally, and also with Switzerland, is on a regional scale a functional area. And I would say that the program, therefore, could be doing some things in the program area as a whole, but this does not exclude that there are within those particular areas smaller functional areas of a different scale, of a more local scale. And I remind you of, no, I will come back to that later. Then that's for the fact when you have a cross-border program that matches the notion of functional area and integrated territory. But I think most of the time, to be honest, the integrated territorial development principles will have to apply to smaller territories than an entire program area. I take the example here of very long borders. You know that Spain-Portugal, for instance, is the longest of all our internal borders. And there, frankly, you cannot really see that there is an integrated territorial development possible if you cover the entire border. You have to go to a more local level to identify these interdependencies and interactions, and then to identify smaller territories on which to apply PO5. Or if you have not necessarily a very long border, but a heterogeneous border where you have, for instance, let's say a rural area with inside it some important urban centers. I take here the example of the border between France and Belgium, where clearly you can see that to the north it's a very urban border, to the south it's a very, very rural border. And frankly speaking, should we not try to look at the specificities of those territories in order to have more targeted actions and therefore better impact? And you also have another case of twin cities, which we have a lot of across the European Union. I mentioned here, of course, here Frankfurt Oder with Lubice. You also have Valga Valga, very well known in Estonia, Latvia, Komano, Komarom, Slovakia, Hungary. You could have Tornio Aparanda. You have many, many, many such cases along borders. And clearly here, the way we see it, inside the cross-border program, there is scope for doing very specific things with those particular sub-territories. And to illustrate, I took back one of the maps that Jean Pironi used in his presentation to show you here. I wanted to focus on the Upper Rhine, which on this map is the red line. Regional level, very strong coherence of the territory here regionally, and some actions that need to happen at that level. But inside that red line, which happens to be also the program area, you can see light blue zones, which are of a more local scale, where of course then a differentiated approach could be used to address the very specific interactions and interdependencies that happen there. You look at Strasbourg-Kehl, it's quite obvious that that area might require something different from a much bigger, much more rural area up north. Okay, so here to clarify a little bit, you could apply PO5 to an entire program area if you have a coherent territory or if you are doing things of a regional scale. It doesn't exclude that you have also sub areas inside your program to which you apply PO5 separately, because for each area you would of course need to have clear needs and assets identified. Okay, so it's really, as I said, it's something that you need to identify as program authorities with your programming task force, with the help of external expertise if you are buying that, to really do a territorial analysis, a very serious one. Now, back to the notion of integrated territorial development. How would it work? Well, you would have to identify the territory that I've been discussing now for the past 10 minutes, and identify the needs and assets of that territory that needs to then really find their way into a strategy. This is absolutely central to the whole process that we would like to see happening under PO5. There has to be a strategy behind each integrated territorial development plan for a defined territory. It has to be multi-sectoral. That's the absolute central point also of PO5, that you don't do one particular type of intervention, like you do only employment or you do only transport. It has to be multi-sectoral. That's the whole point of the integrated dimension. Having said that, it's pretty clear that some sectors could be more dominant than others, that you don't need to have equally spreading your actions across 3 or 4 or 5 different sectors. In some cases, one sector will be much more crucial than others because it will unlock something, it will unlock a potential, or it will deblock a particular obstacle. What we really cannot have under PO5 is a series of isolated actions or projects that are not connected to each other. All the projects under PO5 will have to be interconnected under the one integrated territorial development strategy for the one type of territory that you have. If you have 2 or 3 or 4, they have to be interconnected within those different territories that you have identified. So no more isolated projects that are not directly linked with each other. I take again the example of France-Belgium. There's a very rural area in the border, very large part of the border. And this clearly is an area where on both sides of the border, they call themselves with the same name. So clearly you can see here that they have a shared identity. Les Ardennes is both Les Ardennes in France or in Belgium. And for rural tourism, they are very strong. They are very attractive. And it's a massive sector for them. They're also very strong on the wood industry, and they have developed a very strong labeled and quality food production over the recent past. Well, frankly, if you look at that, you have enough here to just say that why don't we then have a single territorial, integrated territorial development strategy for that area across the border, both sides, and look at the different elements that I mentioned here on the slide, and be multi-sectoral and see how the different sectors would then all contribute to having a stronger territory. Another example that I mentioned here is Helsinki-Tallinn, which is within a program, within the Central Baltic program. Here you have an urban hub between the 2 capitals, which they are separated indeed by a maritime connection, but nevertheless, they are integrated to a large extent. They have commuters, they do business together, they have connections in education. Of course, you also have a port and harbor management, multimodal public transport. So here, again, an area within the program area where you could envisage some very specific actions under a strategy for the area. Norte de Portugal, Galicia is the same. I come back to Spain, Portugal, and my very, very long border there. Well, clearly to the north, between those two regions, Portugal and Spain, you have some very, very strong interdependencies and interactions that can justify having there a PO5 type of intervention with an overarching strategy. France, Switzerland, for instance, again, within that program area, you have 3 very distinct territories that require different types of interventions and a different mix of interventions. Jura to the north, which is quite rural, and then you have Greater Geneva, incredibly urban, and then you have the Northern Alps, which is a mountain area. So really, frankly speaking, here you could very well imagine that you have 3 different PO5 strategies targeting 3 different types of territories, using then actions and projects that make the most sense. So, as I mentioned also earlier, the existence of governance structures can be for you also a very good indicator whether you do have a functional area or a PO5 type of territory in your program areas. There are some very, very competent EGTCs active in cross-border areas, and they show you that there is a functional area because they actually operate together jointly over a certain territory. I would say it's something to really take into account in your analysis. Euro regions, Euro districts, twin city cooperation, all of these things are relevant. Conventions and conferences also exist, tend to cover larger areas, but again with an internal coherence and an internal functionality. And since under PO5 multi-level governance is essential because it is bringing Europe closer to the citizens, you could then say that there is a place for these types of governance structures to be highly involved in what is being done under PO5. For me, having these structures there is the perfect place for really putting the partnership principle into action concretely, not just in words, but actually with deeds. How do we then make all of this function under PO5? Well, there are 3 elements. So you need your strategy once. Of course, I assume here that you have defined the territory that you want to address under PO5, 1 or more, according to where you are. So you need to have this strategy. This is absolutely core. This is the starting point, and the strategy has to be based on a very sound evidence-based analysis, define the needs, the assets, and then the objectives. Secondly, in order to put this into motion, as you can see in the nice schema presented here, you then need stakeholders and tools to make it all happen. So this is who does what needs to be defined also under PO5, and I come back to that. And then the projects or the actions chosen come in to meet the objectives that were defined in the strategy. So really, this is mechanically something that is absolutely compulsory if you want to do PO5 in the correct way. So, strategy, starting point. Let's agree that you have defined within your program area a certain territory where you can actually see that integrated territorial development makes sense. That is actually what is needed. You then need to put in place a strategy for that territory. I would not say that this is definitely not done by the managing authority or indeed by the programming task force that you have. It should actually be done by the territorial partners that have a mandate over that particular territory, with a very strong stakeholders participation. So this is really, it's got to be a bottom-up process. It's got to be multi-sectoral. It's got to bring around the table the key actors of that territory that can actually change that territory. We strongly advise that this strategy can contain already a list of projects or operations that need to be supported for the strategy to meet its objectives. It could also be based or use an already existing strategy. You don't need to start from scratch. If you have, let's say, an area where there is an EGTC that has a mandate over that territory, where the EGTC represents all the levels of government around that area, and they have a strategy, by all means, this can definitely become the strategy to be used under PO5. And we also strongly recommend that you don't look simply at the scope of Interreg funding, but that the strategy is actually broader than that, and that you show where Interreg makes a contribution. Ideally, it would be, of course, best if these strategies were already in place at the time of submitting the program for adoption to the Commission. Of course, that would be ideal, also because you can then start implementing the strategies much faster. However, it is not compulsory. So if you know that you have certain territories, you know you would want to use PO5 because it makes sense to have this type of approach, but you need a bit more time. It's perfectly fine to propose to use PO5 in the program, to earmark a budget for that, and then to define the territories and strategies at a later stage. Even you could use the Interreg specific objective on governance, on cooperation, to finance some of that work if it was necessary. Of course, you run a little bit the risk of running late, but never mind. If the rest of the program, I would say, is progressing well, you don't have any risks of decommitment, you should then envisage doing it that way. Then I mentioned the tools and how we then translate this strategy into action. You need to define how the strategy will then translate into projects. And this is not something that should be done by the classic program bodies, but should be done by those who own the strategy that we discussed a bit earlier, those who drafted the strategy and want to implement the strategy. They should be the ones who then select the projects that should be supported. It's absolutely essential that this selection happens at that level. Of course, it's by delegation, if you want, from the monitoring committee. And then that particular group of people, representatives, should also monitor progress of the implementation of the strategy. I don't mean here that they take over the role of the Joint Secretariat in monitoring individual projects, because I guess that stays with the Joint Secretariat, but monitor overall progress on are we meeting our objectives, the objectives we had set in the strategy. Keeping the implementation on track, of course, part of the same idea. It could, however, if you wanted to, you could decide that the whole strategy is implemented by a body, a legal body, to which the managing authority delegates some of its functions. In that case, you have an intermediate body, absolutely fully acceptable, not a problem, but not compulsory. If you go down that route, you would then have to include that intermediate body in your management and control system. All right, but not obligatory. It's, if you feel this is a little bit too complex in your area, please don't consider it as a must. And then you can finance that the operation of that particular mechanism either under PO5, or you could also use the specific objective on cooperation governance. in every case, also, unless you use an intermediate body, contracting is left to the managing authority. So it's not a massive change for you. The managing authority retains the contracting of individual projects. And of course, therefore, also the managing authority needs to be associated to the process. Now, in order to achieve this process that I just described, you have also different choices. You can actually use an off-the-shelf tool, which is already pre-designed for you, and they are already even very well described in the regulations. An integrated territorial investments is one of those tools, which is generally suited more to, I would say, urban areas, or a community-led local development, which is also a well-defined tool, which is much more relevant for rural areas, because here you're talking about supporting small communities, bottom-up development, and very, very relevant for developing, for instance, villages in rural areas. So these are the two off-the-shelf tools that you could simply take off the shelf and use. But you might also decide that none of these two tools suit your needs, and to opt, therefore, for a tailor-made solution, a tailor-made tool. For instance, you have an EGTC already established, well-functioning, that covers exactly the territory that you have defined. Well, why not consider using that EGTC as a tool to implement the strategy, either as an intermediate body or not, simply as the body that will look after the selection of projects and make sure that it's all on track. You could do that. Or you could then set up a structure for this particular purpose. Again, we will hear some examples from France, Italy, I think, from Slovakia, Hungary, where in two cases they have actually implemented integrated territorial development plans with very specific structures developed for that. You could also say that you do this via a specific steering committee that will then look after all the selection and the follow-up to the selection for that particular territory. Or you could indeed even use a small project fund to implement the integrated territorial strategy. As I already said, the contracting can remain with the managing authority. Now, of course, this has clear consequences on the governance of your program. It's going to be very hard to implement PO5 without any changes to what you have been doing in the past, except maybe in cases where you already have let's say, steering committees that act on sub areas of your program area, if you see what I mean. There you could say it's not so different. You could use PO5 without too many changes. But in the classic program management case that we have, there I would say that you would have to tweak a few things to meet the requirements of PO5. And there would have to be a clear delegation of some decision-making powers from the monitoring committee to whoever would be in charge of selecting operations. There has to be a high level of trust, therefore, between the different bodies involved or representatives involved. And there has to be a strong reliance on the partnership principle under PO5. It's already strong in cross-border cooperation or transnational cooperation generally, but I would say it's even stronger in the case of PO5 because you have to have this direct link to the specific territory that you are covering. So my recommendation would be to do this if you have a coherent territory where you know that a multi-sectoral approach will make a difference, and please don't do it simply to access PO5 funding or to say we will put under PO5 what we can't put under the other POs. That would be very counterproductive. Now, a more tricky part of the presentation, but something that I wanted to put in because I know that a lot of you will ask and will want to hear how we see the link between cultural heritage and therefore tourism. Let's be frank about the vocabulary here. And PO5, because it's clearly mentioned in the name of the PO. But again, I would say that the logic is not very different from what I have explained in the previous slides. Again, for us, the starting point has to be a specific territory. And I think in the case of cultural heritage tourism, we can talk about a certain identity. And I don't mean here a national identity. What I mean is an identity connected to the territory on which you operate. And it could be that this identity stems from historical links, from history, the last centuries, what's happened in Europe. I have mentioned a few examples here on the slide. It could be that nature is actually what brings your territory together. You have a set of mountains, the Tatras, for instance, between Slovakia and Poland, and that really this makes a very compact, coherent territory on which you want to have a sound tourism strategy. The Pyrenees, for instance, are the same. Or it could be that it's activity-based, that you attract already, or you have a very high potential to attract people to do a certain type of activity, like sailing, or walking, or spa tourism. So really, we start from the territory, and we start from this destination tourism, as we call it now, where you focus on the specific product that you will want to develop in your territory. And again, I repeat what I said before, we really have to have a strategy behind the investments that are then selected, and it cannot really be small tourism projects here and there without any connections between them. This has happened for the past few programming periods, and we really need to adapt to what we want now. And again, multi-sectoral, I come back to that, and you're going to tell me, yeah, but how do I do that in tourism? Well, tourism is an activity, or cultural heritage is an activity where you have different types of interactions that need to happen. Of course, you need to have your product, but you also need to have the right people to sell the product. You need to have the right people to make use of the product. You need to have accessibility. We would want more and more to promote green measures in tourism, slow tourism, that kind of stuff. So you again need to look at this whole comprehensive, holistic approach to cultural heritage or tourism in the particular territory that you want to target. That's really, really important. Finally, I wanted to say, if the targeted territory in terms of tourism, the destination that you want to promote or develop, coincides with the program area, well, then clearly the implementation can be done with the program structures, because here we do have the right coincidence between who then make the decisions and the territory on which these decisions will have an impact. But having said that, I would argue that looking at the regulation, you would want to establish, in that case, a specific steering committee for the selection of operations for cultural heritage and tourism. So what I'm saying here is, if your entire program area coincides with a destination or an identity in tourism, then you can use the program structures to implement that, but you would still want to have a specific committee to select the project, because that committee would have to involve the experts from that particular sector and the territorial representatives with the legitimacy to make the decisions. That's really, really quite important. And then you would want to really ensure capitalization very early in the process so that we can see that you are moving along the strategy that has been set up at the beginning. And the comprehensive monitoring would then be, of course, by the program structures, project by project, the system you have for making sure projects submit their reports on time, etc., etc. But you would still want that committee, subcommittee, or steering committee, you call it what you like, to have a global view of whether the sound tourist or culture strategy that is underpinning all the decisions is being followed. Now, tourism or cultural heritage could, of course, be financed under other policy objectives. We have already, I think, clarified that a few times. What would be different then if you did it under other policy objectives? The difference would be that the main objective would not be tourism or culture, but the main objective would be what that policy objective is supposed to be doing, i.e. innovation, for instance, or sustainable development, green Europe, or skills. In that case, that would be the target, the main objective. And you would lose, of course, this holistic approach, I would say, because it's very difficult under the other POs to then earmark money for tourism. That's not really going to work. You don't have specific objectives there that you can say, oh, this is for tourism. So you will have a difficulty in having a very holistic and comprehensive approach. But of course, you could do it. If you decide that your destination is well known, you don't need to work on that anymore, but you really need some skills because, you know, links with the higher education or with schools is not so strong. You lack a labor force with a certain set of skills, then by all means do that under PO4 if that's appropriate. Voilà. Globally, this is a little bit what I wanted to say. I'm very aware that the presentation focuses much on cross-border cooperation. However, I would really want to emphasize that the principles explained also apply to transnational programs. But here, of course, it's a little bit different because the scales of cooperation are different. Having said that, I mentioned here a few territorial logics that could underpin the use of PO5 for transnational programs. And then if you look at these, for instance, sea basins, river basins, pretty obvious. TEN-T corridors, I think some excellent work has already been done on focusing on these corridors inside transnational programs to see how regions affected can actually make the most of these corridors and also decrease the potential negative impacts that we have to recognize can affect some regions. You could look at coastal management, you could look at maritime spatial planning. There is a directive on that. Not sure it's being used or developed as much as it should be. You could look at islands as a specific type of territory where you would want to have an integrated territorial development. Okay, so look at that. The principles that I mentioned and the tools and the strategy and all of that, it's all very valid also for transnational programs. This is it. I hope it's been useful. I hope it has clarified a number of concepts and approaches that DG Regio is looking to see in future programs. And I let you digest all of this, and we come back to possible questions that you might have in a future session. I thank you very much for your attention, And I look forward to having some further exchanges on this. Thank you and bye-bye to all.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for this very comprehensive and very much appreciated presentation. And as you mentioned, there will be for sure more questions by the programs, and we're very happy to have you with us for another online question and answer session. For all you watching this video, you will find more information about the upcoming question and answer session on our Interreg website. And of course, once we have conducted this online session, it will be recorded and made available also on the website. And last but not least, you can of course now already submit us your questions you have by using the hopefully meanwhile well-known email address questions.territoriality@interreg-eu.net. Thank you very much. Goodbye.